Hey, welcome back to Daily Hope. I wonder, have you ever known someone who just turned away from God or resisted God over and over again, maybe refused to believe in God, and it just destroyed their life? Well, sadly, the book of Second Kings is the historically accurate, true story of God's people turning away from Him. We've been looking book by book. We're going through the Bible. We started in Genesis, and we saw God's creation. We saw His promise to Abraham. We saw Him lead God's people through the desert through Moses. We saw Joshua go into the promised land. And then as God's people inhabit the promised land, we saw an era of the judges and how God led through judges and through prophets. We saw in 1 Samuel that God's people demanded an earthly king, even though God alone wanted to be their king. In 1 Samuel, we see God give them a king, and we see in 1 and 2 Samuel and in 1 Kings the good early kings, David and Solomon, but third generation, that last king after David, there was one before David, Saul, but anyhow, that generation turns evil. And in prosperity and blessing, God's people turn away from Him, which, just my opinion, but that's largely been the story of America. If you were to rewind 100 years and look at an average Sunday, 95% of Americans were in a church on Sunday hearing the Bible preached. They didn't have running water or electricity at all their houses, but they had the Bible, and though they were imperfect, and though there were a lot of broken problems in the country, people were seeking the Bible, and that's what kept making the country better. Now in prosperity and wealth, as ignorant beneficiaries of all the believers who've gone before us, many are turning away from Christ, turning to money and wealth and pleasure instead, and it's just history repeating itself. 2 Kings is the people of God. First, they infight and they divide into two kingdoms. There's 10 tribes called Israel still, and there's 2 tribes called the kingdom of Judah. They've each got 2 different kings. They kind of don't like each other. Then eventually the book of 2 Kings is going to end, and Israel, those 10 tribes, are exiled out of the promised land into Assyria. Judah, those 2 tribes are exiled into Babylon, and that's going to lead into the future books when, eventually Nehemiah is going to come back to rebuild the walls, etc. There's going to be a lot of pain and a lot of suffering because over and over the people of God just chose to turn away from Him. Now, I want to encourage you, if you feel like our whole nation's turning away from God, that might be the majority of people, but there's always a faithful remnant. And here in the book of 2 Kings, that faithful remnant is represented by Elijah, one of the great prophets of the Bible. So when you read 2 Kings, it's almost more the story of Elijah and these really faithful, godly prophets who, it says in one place, there was more than 1,000 of them. They stayed true to God, even as all God's people turned away. And that's one of our commitments as a movement and as a church. We often say, in our church, Christ is the head, His word is our guide, His Spirit is our power. So no matter what happens in the culture, in the nation, even if a bunch of other churches start to turn away from the Bible, we're always going to stay true to the Bible. We're always going to stay true to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And God has called us to be a faithful remnant. I also want to encourage you that at Connection Point, our movement in central Indiana, we're seeing God work in such a powerful way in our young people, our teens, our young adults. There's great hope for the future because young people are on fire for the Lord. And if you're part of supporting what God does through our church, thank you. If you want to kind of lock in your legacy to be part of something bigger than you, find a biblical movement that's raising the next generation for Christ. We're all about that. There's other churches and ministries that do that too. We'll put a link at the end of this if God leads you to support Connection Point in your giving or in your estate or legacy, maybe in your will or bequeathal or trust. But let's get to our scripture for today. 2 Kings 17, verses 13 and 14 kind of summarize everything I just explained. And it says this, quote, "Again and again, the Lord had sent His prophets and His seers to warn both Israel and Judah," that's all 12 of the tribes together, quote, "Turn from all your evil ways. Obey my commands and decrees, the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I gave you through my servants the prophets. But the Israelites would not listen. They were as stubborn as their ancestors who had refused to believe in the Lord their God. May that not be true of us. May our legacy be one of surrender and belief and being the faithful remnant. I will see you tomorrow for more Daily Hope.